No, I never, he never came back to you. He never came back to you. He should have. He should have. No, you absolutely should. I'll hold it up. I'll introduce it right at the beginning.
Good evening, everybody. Happy New Year and welcome to our first event of 2016. In a second, I'm going to hand you over to David Loyne, who's going to chair tonight's discussion. David's a journalist, author, and was recently the BBC correspondent in Afghanistan. Just recently back from there. Before I do that, if I can ask you quickly to switch your phones to silent. And when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we are streaming tonight's event live on our YouTube channel. So over to David.
Millicent, thank you very much and welcome to the first Wednesday of 2016, and it's 12th night, traditionally the time when we put away the Christmas decorations and get back to normal. And getting back to normal this year means getting back to an intractable problem with so many different tentacles in it. And we have on the panel, on the platform tonight, a panel of, I hope, illuminating guests who will be able to look into some of the challenges, and I don't think we expect to reach any conclusions tonight. One man on the panel who has a piece of naked commercialism, book available at the back, Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War, available tonight for the first time. In fact, Robin tells me this is the first time he's actually seen the physical copy of the book, so a very exciting moment for an author when you see it in print, and it's available at the back of the room at the end tonight. And I would just mention separately one other event that I'm also partially involved in, but there's if you have never seen physically the boats that refugees are coming across the water to Greece in, there is one hanging as part of an art installation in St James's Church, Piccadilly, and it's pretty small dinghy, and when you see it and you realise that 62 people survived this very difficult crossing. It's a rather wonderful art installation by an artist called Arabella Dorman, and next Wednesday night, the 13th, there is at 6:30 in St James's Church, Piccadilly, Arabella will be on a panel talking about this rather extraordinary installation, and I fully recommend anyone who's interested in this just to see it and see the authentic thing for the first time that we are challenged by with the refugee crisis that we are facing. So it is an old problem that we're facing in 2016, but we'll try and find tonight some fresh solutions. Just to very quickly go through some of the things that we know are the issue around Daesh, ISIS, and the problems in the region. The refugee crisis itself, something that challenged Europe in completely new ways last year. A war without any obvious allies. Britain is suddenly engaged now in a bombing campaign again in a country where there is no easy answer. There's no one to put in power that Britain would think that they would like to. And of course it's a war that for the first time has involved NATO and Russia directly in the shooting down of a Russian plane. And there's a worsening conflict now between the Shia and Sunni world, and this is something that we'll get onto with the news this week of the execution of a prominent Shia cleric in Saudi Arabia, among a number of other people who were executed over the new year. There may, of course, be an upside to all of these issues. Russia and the US are talking for the first time in the region. They're talking all the time because Russian planes are in the air and American planes are in the air. So all of the deconfliction issues that you need to have for planes to be flying mean that there are new relations between Russian and American military figures on the ground. Iran and Saudi Arabia are talking together about how to deal with Syria. So it's not all intractable. The talking process, and we certainly will talk about this tonight, is something that may ultimately yield fruit. A better government has emerged in Baghdad that the West is now feels much more confident in backing than the previous one. And Israel, for once, is not right at the centre of the Middle Eastern problem. So you have another whole regional issue which is happening, which Israel is a bit part player in, having for so many years been the focus of so much attention in the Middle East. There is also, of course, the intriguing British political story in this. Why did David Cameron need to engage in sending just a couple more warplanes to bomb Syria? Well, of course, it split the Labour Party rather successfully, and he's continuing to reap political dividends for that. Cynical moi. On the panel, in the far end, Azadeh Moaveni, who teaches now at Kingston University, also a very prominent freelance journalist, has done some extraordinary work, particularly around women, with talking to ISIS women, and she tells me she's heading for Tunisia later in the year to complete that project. She was Time magazine's Middle Eastern correspondent and has written a couple of books that sound like romantic novels. Half of the title sounds like a romantic novel until you get to the other half of the title, Lipstick Jihad and Honeymooners in Tehran, both of which describe her own life as someone who comes from an Iranian family and then went back to Iran to look at it. Sitting next to Azadeh, Shiraz Maher, an expert in de-radicalisation at the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation at King's College, was nearly late tonight because he's just getting the final edition of his next book to the printers. So, and you'll be back, I'm sure, to talk about it when it comes out, Shiraz. Robin, I've already bigged up with his book, which I'm sure you'll all buy at the end. Robin Yassin Kassab, journalist and author of the novel The Road from Damascus and the Burning Country book, which has just come out, and Richard Spencer, the Middle Eastern editor of the Daily and Sunday Telegraph, who has reported right across the region and has been one of the people who has been right into the region itself, into Aleppo in particular, when Jabhat al-Nusra split to give birth to Daesh, the new movement that we're facing. I want to start with Robin. We were talking beforehand, Robin, about Daesh IS, and you said perhaps we're obsessed with the wrong enemy. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think Daesh is an enemy, but it's a symptom rather than a cause. If you want to look at it's a multifaceted problem. Obviously, there's Daesh in Syria, there's Daesh in Iraq, and then there's the effects of Daesh and the recruitment of people to Daesh in the West and throughout the Arab world and in Chechnya and Russia and elsewhere. It's a symptom. Daesh in Syria is a symptom of President Assad's war against his own people, who a significant proportion of whom came out in 2011, 2012 in a revolution for democracy. Well, first they were asking just for reforms, but then when he responded with extreme violence, they started asking for a change of regime, for a complete revolution. He responded to that with extreme violence. He released jihadists from prison at the same time that he was a lot of jihadists who went on to join Daesh, Jabhat al-Nusra, and other all Syrian groups, which we might get onto later, like Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar al-Sham. He released the leaderships of these people from prison, Salafists who he had facilitated their passage to Iraq during the American occupation. When they came back, he put them back in prison, and then he released them at the beginning of the revolution, at the same time that he was rounding up the non-violent activists for assassination by torture.
So he was deliberately radicalising his own opposition.
He provoked a civil war because he knew that he couldn't survive a reform process. He needed to terrify his Alawite minority base that this is not about democracy, it's about Islamism. He needed also to terrify the West and commentators in the West, and he's been very successful. So here we are tonight discussing what to do about the enemy Daesh, and not what to do about the man who has killed 95% of the dead people in Syria over the last 5 years, Bashar al-Assad, the man that 70% of the refugees in Europe say that they're escaping from. We're not talking about that. In fact, the Russians, and I think it's a great, I'm guessing I'm going too far now, but I think it's a great, this is the middle of our conversation, but I think it's a great shame that people think it's good that the Americans and the Russians are talking now about how to work out their bombing raids, and you do here and you do there, you do the Syrian opposition and we'll do Daesh. It's a disaster what Russia is doing in Syria. It's taking us much further away from any peace process. It's intensifying and expanding the war, and I think we should.
We will come on to that. We will come on to that in a minute. But just on the emergence of Daesh itself, there is this other group, Jabhat al-Nusra. Now, you believe that they're ultimately potentially a bigger global threat than Daesh. We're pretty frightened of Daesh at the moment. Why should we be frightened of them?
Daesh and Nusra are the two, if you like, two branches of Al-Qaeda. They follow different traditions, but they, if you can use that word, which split. They're both very intelligent in very different ways, and they're both following a power program in very different ways. I think that Daesh, by making enemies of everybody, will be defeated. It's only there because of the chaos. If we could stop the chaos, then it would disappear because it doesn't have a real support base. Unlike groups like Ahrar al-Sham and Jaish al-Islam, it doesn't have any real support base. But in the chaos, yes, I think we can do something against Daesh by bombing it, because it's set itself up in its own area. It doesn't collaborate with anybody. It's made very clear that everybody else, from Jabhat al-Nusra to the democratic opposition to Assad and the international community, are its absolute enemy. So it will be defeated by these people. Nusra is taking what, in the long term, I think will be a much more intelligent path, which is it's exploiting the way that the Syrian people have been abandoned by the world to this terrible fate. It's using its soft power, it's working in collaboration with people, it's embedding itself in local communities. And you meet people in Syria who are moderates. I don't like this language. We have to, anyway. Who are moderates, who are not fanatical. It's a useful shorthand. Who are not fanatical Islamists by any means. Who even want to live in a country with Alawis and Christians and so on in the future in a secular state. But they won't hear a word said against Jabhat al-Nusra because they perceive it as Jabhat al-Nusra solved the bread crisis in Aleppo in 2012 when there was a bread crisis. When Jabhat al-Nusra is on the front lines defending people from the attacks of Assad and his Shia militias from Iran and so on and so forth. So although there is a lot of resistance still amongst the Syrian people to Jabhat al-Nusra, it's following a much more intelligent path. It's not attacking the West now, but it's very clear that what it's trying to do is to build a base on the Eastern Mediterranean from which, in the future, when it's in a strong position, when it's part of Syrian society and can't be turfed out, then it will attack the West and elsewhere.
Richard, you were there in Aleppo when this happened, when Daesh emerged. And did Daesh just look like a sort of a temporary problem then, with this Jabhat al-Nusra as potentially the bigger ultimate threat?
No, I think right from the beginning, you could tell that this was a big thing. And when you talk about a split, it was who was splitting from whom. I mean, Jabhat al-Nusra basically declared independence from ISIS, Islamic State, from Baghdadi, basically, and then Zawahiri, the paramount leader of Al Qaeda, had to decide which one he went with, and he went with Jabhat al-Nusra. But by that time, they had large amounts of territory. They already had. They were in alliance with various other groups in Raqqa, but they were clearly the dominant force, or Jabhat al-Nusra were the dominant force. And as we know, what happened then was that when they did split and they fought each other, eventually ISIS took the eastern half and Jabhat al-Nusra stayed in the western half. But at that time, this was in 2013, there were still people joining Jabhat al-Nusra from the moderate rebel groups. Moderate rebel groups felt abandoned. All the things that Robin has said, they felt abandoned. Jabhat al-Nusra were honest. The corruption thing was a very important thing, that Jabhat al-Nusra was seen as clean, whereas the other rebel groups, partly because they had no money, were extorting money, and there was this whole weapons trade going on, whereas Jabhat al-Nusra, through its historical Al-Qaeda fundraising mechanisms, had good weapons. So perfectly normal guys from the villages of northern Syria were joining up to Al-Qaeda without, they were sitting there chatting to me as if I was their friend, but saying, well, I'm joining Jabhat al-Nusra, and I was saying, well, do you want to kill me? Of course I don't want to kill you, but that's how it was.
They were doing that as a regional, local revolutionary group, rather than a global jihad.
And this is where Zawahir has been very clever, of course, by going with that. I mean, nobody likes ISIS. Zawahir and Bin Laden didn't like ISIS 10 years ago. They were telling off Zarqawi, Baghdadi's predecessor, for being too brutal and too violent in Iraq. And they realised that the future, and Zawahiri, I think, although he has played, a lot of people in the jihadi community think he's played too long a game, but he's playing a very long game compared even to Bin Laden, and very much saying, embed in the local community, don't defend anyone. I don't know if you remember, he did this with in Mali. He sent messages to the Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and all those crazy romantic gangs, Mohammed, what's his name, Mokhtar, not Mokhtar, saying, remember when you take over Mali, be nice to everyone, don't scare people, don't do the jihadi thing, so work with the locals. And they, of course, actually ignored him, but that was what his whole plan is: embed, and then we'll see. And that's a much more dangerous, much more difficult enemy long term for the West than Baghdadi's craziness, I think.
Do you believe, Azadi, that either of these are groups that the West could or should negotiate with?
Well, that's quite difficult. I mean, ultimately, there's a short-term set of questions, which is, how to bring about an end to, the conflict in the short term, and which group is positioned, on the ground in ways with different constituencies to be able to do that. Some military element from the West is inevitable, and probably you would support it? Well, I mean, it's very difficult, and I think this is something that the Americans in particular are struggling with. I mean, this question of should we engage with Jabhat al-Nusra, especially in the last 2 or 3 months, has emerged. And I think it's politically very, very tricky. I mean, it brings up the ghosts of Afghanistan and the jihad there. Are we going to, in the short term, work with people on the ground militarily to achieve a short-term aim, and then to have empowered them, to have, to an extent, legitimized them on the ground so that they are the political future that we fear, that will then potentially have a profound backlash for our interests in the region and beyond the region. But I think that it's really important, as Robin and Richard have been saying, to look at the landscape and the role that Nusra is playing, because I think we are, and I think the media is very much a part of this, obsessed with ISIS as the enemy, and those of us who spend time there and talk to people and see the reach and the depth of the appeal and success of Nusra on the ground, can project 5 years down the line or 3 years down the line and recognize, the problem that could potentially emerge out of this. The women that I spoke to, who had, were from Raqqa originally and had joined ISIS and worked with them in their morality brigade, and these are women who, had escaped ISIS. They came out into southern Turkey. They had seen the worst of the organization because they had been married to fighters. There was pressure on them to remarry very quickly. They were completely disillusioned. To them, ISIS was the worst thing that could have befallen their lives, after Assad. But yet, one of them was, when we talked about the future, she said, I believe in Nusra. I want to live in an Islamic state that is ruled by people like this, that tolerates these different minorities, but I see them as following the rules. I see them as not going out of their way and making it part of their ethos to target other Muslims. And they are Islamists, but they go by the rules. They don't bend, the Sharia to fit their brutality. And so there was a real kind of vision of Nusra playing a role in Syria's future in a way. Is it easy to explain, I mean, you did a long project on this, but is it easy to explain why they joined in the first place? I mean, there must have been many different personal reasons, presumably, but I think it is pretty easily distilled to, Raqqa as a city falling, becoming a city that was, eventually purely in the hands of ISIS. After ISIS took over Nusra and the city became, the stronghold for IS, I mean, it was impossible to work, to earn a living, to even get health care, to do anything really, to have access to electricity without some level of accommodation with this organization. So it was really for them, you know, a matter of survival, and it wasn't something that they decided immediately. You know, they tried to, and I think their families tried to find ways to cope with this new reality. But it was very difficult. You know, the lawyers were out of jobs. You know, one of the women's father was a farmer, but suddenly, you know, half of Raqqa was a farmer because you couldn't be a lawyer, you couldn't be an MRI technician because there were no more MRI machines to run. So even just getting by was profoundly difficult, and I think that, you know, many chose to flee, and half the city fled, but those who remained out of some kind of mix of desperation and just wanting to cope with the new force in their town decided to start. And I think, you know, it's a process, right, that the compromises become bigger and bigger as you go along, but you don't know that at the outset.
But in terms of the West dealing with them, I mean, the Western press sort of has an obsession with Daesh, which do you agree that that might not in the long term be helpful in terms of understanding what's going on in the region?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, you know, as Robin said at the beginning, I think that Daesh or IS or whatever we want to call them, you know, is a manifestation of a set of geopolitical realities that are fraught, long-standing, and will require attention. I mean, the sectarian, you know, the use of sectarianism by both Saudi Arabia and Iran, of course, you know, this is the big regional dynamic, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But I mean, that is what creates and has created, together with, you know, Bashar and his brutal kind of put down of the uprising, this vacuum in which this kind of jihadism has flourished. So I think the big picture is, you know, Bashar and the forces in the region that, you know, benefit and flourish from, you know, assisting him, or in the case of Saudi, you know, using sectarianism to oppose him.
Shiraz, do you think that Jabhat al-Nusra has the same traction in the West, among the same appeal to young Muslims who are, for whatever reasons, we'll come back into more detail in this later, disenfranchised from Western society? Do they have the same appeal as IS?
Well, they have an appeal in the West amongst older people who have traditionally supported jihadist causes in the past. So those individuals who were sort of heavily invested in the sort of post 9/11 conflicts, Afghanistan, Iraq, who were sort of, you could say, quiet supporters of Al-Qaeda, who felt Al-Qaeda had a point, and cheered on particularly their campaign in Iraq after 2003. They still have a degree, I think, if they're sort of looking at this ideologically at least, of support and sympathy for Jabhat al-Nusra because it's Al-Qaeda. And as a result of that, they are on that side of the divide in terms of their opposition to Islamic State and what it's doing out in the eastern parts of the country. But it's very interesting that Jabhat al-Nusra never called itself Al-Qaeda in Syria. This actually came out as a result of the split with ISIS and Baghdadi saying, you know, these guys are AQ. And the reality of that is Al-Qaeda realized and has learned, both what Robin and Richard have been saying really has been this fact that Al-Qaeda over the last 15 years has been on an incredibly steep learning curve. They've learnt far more about warfare, insurgency, human terrains than we have, frankly. And that's why, to put it very bluntly, they're winning. That's why they're winning. So even if you look at the small trove...
They're winning tactically on the ground.
They're winning tactically, but actually...
But they're also winning in the heads of...
They're winning hearts and minds. They're winning politically.
In Syria. Of Muslims in the West as well?
Well, Muslims in the West is a different point here, because let's look at the reality of what will transpire. Whenever an eventual negotiated settlement takes place in Syria at some stage, Jabhat al-Nusra probably won't be at that table. I don't believe they will be there. But as Robin pointed out, they are embedded, they are working so closely with so many other groups on the ground that when Ahrar al-Sham goes to the table, it will indirectly represent, of course, opinions from Jabhat al-Nusra and secure a part of the deal for them. So that's been the real triumph of the movement and its activity there. They're not using, if you saw Jolani's interview, they've been told not to use Syria as a sort of launch pad for attacks in Europe. Now that's, you know, I think if he'd been allowed to continue the answer, we said for now, because it's expedient not to do that, because it allows them not only to win favor amongst the people, but look at the messaging that Jabhat al-Nusra puts out in the region to Arabs and Muslims. They say, look, we always told you that we weren't extremists. We always told you we followed the moderate and middle path. If you want to see what crazy it looks like, look at ISIS. Right? We're the sort of good guys here. And we've heard all the points about them not being corrupt, about them resolving problems. I look at a lot at the theology of jihadist movements, particularly the Salafi jihadi sort of sphere of activity. And what's really interesting is if you look at some of the more recent interviews that have come out with Sharia officials from Jabhat al-Nusra about why they're not doing certain things, why they don't implement the hudud in all the areas. It has happened in certain cases, but these are the Islamic punishments. Why they're not happening. They've developed a sort of almost progressive, I don't want to put that label on them, but a sort of slightly progressive theology that says, you can suspend these rules in times of war. You can suspend certain things. So they've introduced a degree of pragmatism into the way they do this, which comes back to the point that Richard was making about them saying, when you go into Mali, don't be nuts. Win the support of the people. Have councils for them. So to sort of wrap it up, in essence, they recognized the need to carry public opinion. Now, for people who went at the start of the conflict, who I think were slightly older, who were slightly more ideologically invested in what you might call classical notions of jihad, of defending the oppressed against the oppressor, of helping your sort of fellow Muslim in a time of tyranny and sort of being oppressed as they were by the regime of Bashar al-Assad, people did join Jabhat al-Nusra. They joined auxiliary movements like Jaysh al-Muhajirin wal Ansar, which then supplied groups like Jabhat al-Nusra with fighters. But the youngsters who go are more attracted by sort of much more simplistic and binary ideas, and that's how ISIS messages. And so they go there.
Can I very quickly answer your question? You were asking, Azadeh, if the West could or should deal with
negotiate
with Jabhat al-Nusra in the end. And then, I don't think they ever will sit down with Jabhat al-Nusra, but I agree with Shiraz that when they're embedded in Syrian society, then
there are
other people will represent
groups.
They will have a say. So the answer to the question is that the West will end up having to deal with Jabhat al-Nusra if it continues on its present course, which is to refuse to deal properly with the Free Army. Now, for example, in the south of Syria, the Southern Front, which is a agglomeration of Free Army militias who have signed up to a kind of democratic, they've allowed local council elections. I'd like to talk about local councils if we get a chance, because that's part of the solution. They've allowed local council elections. There's democracy is being practiced in their areas. They are dependent on military aid from a military operations room in Jordan. And the West, the Americans, keep telling the Jordanians and the Saudis and everybody else not to allow the anti-tank weapons and particularly the anti-aircraft weapons that they need. Now, these are people who have refused to work with Jabhat al-Nusra. Unlike the rebels in the north, they've refused to enter into formal alliances with Jabhat al-Nusra. You are giving them no choice. Last week, Sheikh Maskin, a major town in the south, was recaptured by the Assad regime with the help of Iranian militias and under heavy Russian bombardment. That was Russia and Iran and Assad attacking Democrats, the solution. And the West is sitting there watching it and stopping the people who want to give weapons to those people to defend themselves, stopping them doing it. And in other words, giving those people no choice at some point but to say, look, we have to work with Jabhat al-Nusra.
Well, before Richard comes in, local council elections.
Yes.
You mentioned.
Yes. What I want to say about the councils... It's an
unusual moment in the middle of a guerrilla war to...
Well, this is it. I think this is like one of the biggest stories that we have in Syria and in the whole Middle East and in the whole world, is that actually there are Syrians in these conditions practicing democracy. Now, in the previous decade, we had America going to war and Britain going to war supposedly in order to create democracy in the Middle East. And creating a civil war and a state collapse and a disaster in the name of democracy. And then you have people themselves doing it themselves, not being, not asking you to bring it in on tanks and planes. They're doing it themselves when the state has collapsed. There are over 400 councils, revolutionary or local councils in Syria. At the provincial level, they are all democratically elected.
And are they being supported? Because I know that there is some British aid money that
there is
more than many other countries that goes directly into Syria, and these are the sorts of things.
And
that
they go to the councils, and they're going to the councils and to projects with people who are attached to the councils, and that's really positive. We should hear more about that. We should do more of that, and we should insist that those people are part of the solution. Recently, the Saudis in Riyadh brought together quite a good broad spectrum of the Syrian opposition, from people who were tolerated to Assad all the way to Ahrar al-Sham. It brought together the coalition and kind of community and religious leaders and so on. It didn't bring representatives of the councils. Now, the councils are really important for two reasons for any settlement. Because the decentralization model that they offer could allow Syria to remain one country, and at the same time deal with these explosive ethnic and sectarian polarizations. So, for example, the Kurds have already set up, the PYD have already set up their own council system. So they could have their autonomy. That could work within a decentralization system. If, for example, in Tartus, where you have a large Alawi community, lots of Christians, and it's a more liberal coastal city, the local council there in the future may decide that alcohol is freely available, whereas in Hama, for example, or in Deir ez-Zor, the local council may decide that alcohol should be illegal. I mean, these are the way, this kind of decentralization model, using the organizations which Syrians have already created, which are already democratic, using those, supporting those, building those up, encouraging them to build up in regime-controlled areas too, which I think the British are doing. I think they're, which is a very interesting thing. I think that the councils are a really important part of any future settlement, and nobody's talking about it. The media isn't talking about it. I hope that media people here will start talking about the Syrian people in general, and not just the jihadists and the geopolitics.
We'll come back onto what, as it were, what the West can do right at the end, and I'll come to questions quite soon. But I just want to extend it from the sort of the granular discussion of what's going on the ground to the some of the wider regional questions. And I mentioned this issue with Saudi Arabia at the moment. I mean, Richard, what is Saudi Arabia doing at the moment? We know that because of the cut in the price of oil, the country is facing a pretty major economic crisis. It can't afford the huge benefits payments that it currently has for its own people. And it's fighting this very complex war in Yemen that it's not been very successful in. It's finding military intervention just as hard as anybody else does. Surprise, surprise. What's it playing at? What's on Saudi Arabia's mind? Is it a united front, or in terms of its relations with the region?
I don't think it's a united front in terms of its relations with itself, actually. And I mean, the thing about Saudi Arabia at the moment, it's one of those countries where, for years everyone just, that's Saudi. Saudi, what does Saudi do? It, stops women driving, beheads people, don't like it, slightly strange. They won't let me go there, and I wouldn't want to go there even if they did let me go there. So don't have to worry about that. Just nasty, but over there somewhere. And
but carrying on buying their oil and selling them.
And of course, now suddenly it's become incredibly important in the Middle East. It's become a British political issue, and suddenly you have to start looking at it carefully. And what you find is something actually very complex. It's just had a new king. The last king who died in January, he'd been effectively ruling the country for 20 years, and I mean, it's a functioning country. So imagine if you had a prime minister here who died after 20 years, and suddenly everyone was saying, what happens next? It's difficult enough when Thatcher goes and says what happens next, and Major's government is all over the place because everyone says, oh well, Thatcher will just run the country for the next year, 20, 30 years, and we don't have to worry about that. She'll just run it, and then suddenly you've got Major and all his bonkers ministers, and everything falls apart. And there's something similar happening in Saudi Arabia. You've got a new king who is elderly, because that's how their system works. Everyone's saying, how can this be that the 58th son of the founder of Saudi Arabia is now still running the country, and he's got his nephew and his son in the two key positions answerable to him. One in charge of security, one in charge of everything else. His son is in charge of everything else, and his son is hypermanic. His son wants to solve every problem in Saudi Arabia in 6 months because he's 30 and ambitious and volatile and impulsive. And so he suddenly decides, let's take out Iran and Russia and fracking, all that by cutting the oil price. Let's, sort out Yemen once and for all. Let's do all these things. And meanwhile, there's a power struggle between him and his uncle, who's in charge of security, and it's probably the uncle who said, you know, all this talk about reform, which the young son is encouraging, talking about getting the youth of Saudi Arabia involved in politics in somehow. And the uncle, who's sitting there, and he's from the single most conservative branch of the royal family, is sitting there sort of not on your nelly, and it's him who suddenly says, right, we're going to show the world, and we're going to execute 47 people just to show the world that we are not giving in, and if we are going to do reform, we are not going to fall into the trap of all reformist regimes all through history, is that the minute you reform is when you're weakest and when you get overthrown, you know, which is the historical pattern. He's saying if you're going to reform, you know, everybody who can oppose us is going to be dead. You know, blunt as that. You know, this is not a subtle part of the world. Saudi Arabia, it has subtlety within it, but it knows that its messaging cannot be subtle because that is not what people expect from it. So that's what's happening there.
So if you were looking at what's happening in Syria and Iraq as ultimately a big sort of Sunni Shia split, that it's really just that's the big issue. The big Sunni player in the region is not a very reliable ally if you're any one of these different Sunni groups.
Just to finish, I mean, looking at it, you know, I'm putting the Saudi position because I know it quite well because I've been there quite recently and I've talked to a number of the players involved. And I want to say I'm not by any means defending their approach. I'm just trying to say how they see the world. And they see the world, they see that they are becoming players by choice because America has pulled out. And in fact, they're right to think that. America does not like Saudi Arabia. We don't like, you know, who are Saudi Arabia's closest allies? It's Britain and America. Go to anyone on any street corner in America or Britain and say, those Saudis, they're great, aren't they? You know the result you're going to get, and we're democracies, so this is a kind of problem. And so, you know, they think of us as unreliable allies, and they're kind of right. You know, a lot of what Bush and Obama have done in the last 15 years in American policy has been to, you know, undercut Saudi Arabia. One of the reasons they went into Iraq was because they wanted a new ally in the Middle East, a new oil-producing ally in the Middle East, so they wouldn't have to rely quite so much on Saudi Arabia. You know, and Obama has, you know, supported the Arab Spring. He supported, you know, democracy in the Middle East. Even George Bush, well, not especially George Bush, said, you know, my aim is democracy in the Middle East. This isn't something that goes down well when you're a hereditary monarchy that's been run by the same brothers of the same man for the last, you know, 70 years. So that doesn't go down very well. So they are saying, right, we're going to take charge. We're in charge of the Sunni world. We are in charge of our security interests now. We are in charge of our positioning in the Middle East. We don't like Iran. We don't like what Iran's doing. America's even cozying up to Iran with this nuclear deal. We're going to take action. Now, I say I don't defend that, but that is how they see the world.
Azadeh.
My perspective on the Saudi image in the West is slightly different. I mean, I think, especially in the States, for many, many years, it was really the inverse to my mind. I mean, Saudi was the reliable ally. Saudi was a country that sent Prince Bandar to wear cowboy boots and, you know, join George W. Bush at his ranch. I mean, it was a country that had this incredibly Teflon reputation in the States, in the media narrative. I mean, despite 19 of the September 11th hijackers being Saudis, it really did not dent this idea that Saudi is our staunch ally in the region. They're close friends with the Bushes. These are people that we can deal with. They're a little bit exotic. They have meetings in tents, but, you know, they have safeguarded our interests for many years, and we will be loyal to them. Whereas it was Iran that had, you know, and has had all throughout, you know, elections where women can drive, that's, you know, had a nominal constitution that was, you know, the boogeyman, you know, the country that executed everyone and where women were, you know, in burqas. And so to me, it's been something of the inverse for much of the last 15 years. And it's really only in the last perhaps year or two that is shifting a little bit, that you have, you know, open discussions, you know, in editorial pages about the reliability of Saudi as an ally, and to what extent it's, you know, it makes sense to you know, keep Iran permanently at a distance in order not to upset the Saudis. And I think that, you know, the big, of course, you know, we think about it, and I think it's talked about in the media, again, because it's convenient and I think digestible, the Sunni-Shia rivalry, but I think at the heart, it's clearly, a battle for influence between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
But those two are the big Sunni Shia powers in the region.
Absolutely.
I mean, do you think there's a danger that we're cozying up too much to Iran, that might strengthen Assad's hand, which is very much something that Robin was suggesting?
I mean, I don't think that the question of, I think cozying up to Iran is miscasting it a little bit. I think the aim, especially for the United States, has been to forestall Iran being able to weaponize its nuclear program. So, I mean, we were here just, I think, 2 months ago talking about this. I mean, I think the Saudis perpetually hyperventilate at Iran's perceived ambitions and imperial aspirations in the region, and not to discount at all what the Iranians are doing in the ground in Syria. But I think that the nuclear deal, and we heard Jamie Rubin say this a couple of months ago, was primarily, an arms control treaty designed to prevent Iran from, a program that could weaponize. What it will mean beyond that in terms of rapprochement is all sort of theoretical and yet to be seen. I think the Saudis deeply fear what it could mean, but in terms of, that as an eventuality, nothing has emerged yet. I mean, sanctions are barely being dismantled. Iran is hardly, at the center of diplomacy in the world, and I think
they've just sent a missile within 1,000 meters of an American warship, which means that sanctions might well be reintroduced.
Absolutely, and we see with the sacking of the Saudi embassy that Iran is deeply factionalized internally, and it's not at all clear that the Rouhani government will have the upper hand. But I think that because this rivalry is very much at the heart of what is happening in Syria, it's very much a crisis of diplomacy for these two to come to the table. And I think, especially since Rouhani has come to power, the Iranians have tried to engage with the Saudis. They have sent, deputy foreign ministers. Foreign Minister Zarif went to King Abdullah's funeral. They've tried to meet the Saudis at the UN. They've tried to engage in track 2 via European capitals and are being rebuffed. So,
Can I jump in?
So,
I have to
and then Shiraz,
because I've talked more than you, Shiraz.
Quickly, Robert, go on quickly.
You said that the Saudis are hyperventilating over the Iranian threat in the region, and they are. They're behaving in an absurd and criminal way as usual. And for example, it's true that Iran helped to destabilize Yemen, but the Saudi reaction to that has destabilized Yemen far more than Iran ever could have done. So I'm not defending Saudi Arabia, but I think one of the many reasons why it executed criminally Sheikh Nimr the other day was because it needs to show to its own constituency domestically, it needs to show that we are standing up to Iran and the Shia in the region. It did it in a criminal and wrong way. But there is this perception in the region, which is absolutely right, because the Iranians, hyperventilating. I mean, the Persian foreigners are in Syria en masse, thousands of them, killing the people. They're running Bashar al-Assad's military effort. They're even running negotiations. When Ahrar al-Sham negotiated over Zabadani, they didn't negotiate with Assad, they negotiated with Iran. Iranian officials boast openly that they now have an empire in the Arab world and that they've got 3 capitals, they're about to get a 4th.
Semicolon, full stop.
Go on.
Shiraz, I'm going to come to questions. Have we got a microphone? Shiraz, you've been very patiently trying to get in.
I just wanted to pick up on this fact that I should clarify. I'm going to explain the Saudi mindset a little bit as well. But before anyone then looks it up and sort of accuses me of sort of bias, I lived in Saudi Arabia for 14 years. I go back frequently, so I put that out as a caveat. But I think spending that amount of time with this very closed society and people does give you an insight. I think you're right. People didn't post 9/11 look at Saudi like this crazy way. It had this Teflon image. It had this ability to come through the 80s without being tarnished in any way, and it's only in the last year or so. But the reality is why. The reality is that Saudi Arabia was a consensus player for all the terrible things they did internally, and for all the things they may have done inside the kingdom that people abroad look at and say, well, we're not really happy with this. We think these are draconian or inhumane policies. The point is Saudi Arabia wasn't in the world trying to reshape it. I wasn't trying to fundamentally sort of reshape the contours of power. Now, Iran has done that. Egypt has done that. Syria has done that. Saddam in Iraq tried that. So Saudi came through on the basis of the fact there was not a consensus player. Post 9/11, internally, it moved very dramatically. to round up al-Qaeda cells. It effectively killed off al-Qaeda within Saudi Arabia in 2 years. That's why they're all now down in Yemen, because they had sanctuary there in what is essentially a failed state on Saudi's doorstep. So that's been the most critical factor in Saudi's ability to have good relations with the world. And I would say, having just been there a few months ago, the Saudis are feeling very, very vulnerable right now. That's the issue. They are feeling cut off. If you look at the first Gulf War, when that took place, what happened? The Saudis lived under a Western, principally American security umbrella. And they're starting to realize that that's not going to last forever. And so now they're having to take it on. I think the whole point why the issue is sort of starting to happen now, Saudi's image is being eroded, is because, as Robin said at the start, we don't talk about Assad anymore. We talk about foreign fighters. We talk about the jihadis in Syria. But actually, that's only part of the picture. We talk about the Sunni jihadis. What about all the Shia that are there? So Iran and the Shia forces are now coming through with this sort of immunity from public debate. And so I think it's perceived Saudi support for the Sunni rebels that people are saying, God, these guys are barbarians and they want to pull back.
I'm going to open it up to the floor. For the tape, remind us who you are, and if you have an affiliation, tell us.
James Thacker, I've worked with 10 human rights groups. You're quite right, they are winning, and who knows who we should be telling them who should be winning at this stage. But Assange and Manning did their noble acts, as was often commented, after the fact. And though you say the Americans are sort of equivocating on this, John Allen was down in Chatham House a month and a half ago saying the Americans are in Iraq and that they're not going to be allowed to win. They can't win because if they do, the Gulf states will collapse. And their special forces, we have General Michael Nagata now, and I gather from the questions that were being asked on Chatham House rules, they're also in Syria. How much do we know the Americans are on the ground there? The pilots in some of these planes being flown out of the Gulf, so it's high tech. It's been bought by the Saudis, but some of the pilots, some of the equipment is actually run by Americans. How much are the Americans there? I think we need to know this ahead of time now.
Does anybody know the answer to that?
Yeah,
Richard.
They're there. The Americans are in, and the British. The British are in Iraq. The British are in Syria. The Americans are in Iraq. And
it's not a secret, is it? It's not a.
I don't think it's ever been formally confirmed, but there are British special forces in northern Syria.
How much are they in control, then?
Sorry?
How much are they in control?
No, they're doing what you would expect. They're scouting. They're helping local forces on the ground coordinate airstrikes. That's the prime responsibility. But of course, if you've got a few SAS guys roaming around in that region north of Raqqa, and of course we know that. There's no secret about the fact they're in Iraq. Obviously, they're doing what the SAS do, which is they're not going to go and take towns and cities, but they're supporting their local allies with tactical advice, which occasionally means a certain amount of self-defense. Sorry?
Is this escalation?
The escalation is the bombing campaign. I don't think it goes beyond the stated policy aims of either Britain or America, because those are very vague. But those are very vaguely stated, of course.
When they were training local forces, it was an extraordinary sort of farcical moment. Why didn't that work?
The Americans.
Yes.
The Americans, that was slightly misrepresented, probably by me as well. There are several different training programs for several different types of forces, and the one that became farcical was a very specific Pentagon program. So it had to be a bit more overt, because it's Pentagon rather than CIA, for particular vetted moderate groups. And the trouble was that I spoke to some of the people who were being vetted, and it was like trying to sort of do a UCAS interview for a university place, when you're sending people into Aleppo. It wasn't really realistic, and so basically, in order to be worthy of a Pentagon program, so this is this is not those nasty people in the CIA who always do nasty things. This is the Pentagon.
But they put lots of people through it.
But in order to put them, they didn't put a huge amount of people through it in the end. They wanted to put a lot of people through it. They only put a few dozen through it, probably a few hundred through it in the end. But in order to be on the Pentagon program, you had to sign so many boxes saying you weren't an Islamist. You basically had to sort of say you were an atheist and got drunk every night. And of course, then
And you had to pledge not to fight Assad.
And you had to pledge not to fight Assad. Of course, that was a completely ridiculous thing. And so the end result was, they just found whoever was drunk every night, and they went and got them. I'm exaggerating for effect, but it was such a ludicrous program. But other programs are going on. The CIA are still involved with British and other Middle Eastern power support, training rebels, particularly from the southern front that Robin was talking about. Probably not as comprehensively or as efficiently as I guess Robin would hope, but that program is still going on. And of course, we're working with the Kurds, both in Iraq overtly, in Syria much more covertly, and it is, of course, it's an extended program. I mean, in Iraq, you literally have British and American special forces going around the battlefront, saying to their local partners, this is what you should be doing, and we're now going to go back to our base. You tell us when you see a jihadi, to give us his coordinates on your. They have these amazing sort of like walkie-talkie things. Give us a call and we'll send in an airstrike. And, you can actually go and see that happening.
There's one right at the back here, and then you.
Saeed Bardar, no affiliation. In terms of the rise of the ISIS, I just wanted to put a level of thinking forward that a lot of people believe in, and that's that Assad was in no way responsible for the rise of ISIS. It was the failed Western policy of bombing and removing secularist dictators, and by doing that, we provided a power vacuum for groups like ISIS, which is a spawn of Al-Qaeda from Iraq, to move in there. We transferred power from central government into mosques. So we have disenfranchised young people going to mosques, no central government to control them, and we see the rise of ISIS. So as so much as we claim that the rise is blamed by the powers and the government which is over there, I think we should actually look at ourselves and.
So this goes back to 2003 and the Iraq War, and as the prime cause of the emergence of
well, it
Daesh.
can be both at once. Yeah.
No, and therefore the question is, shouldn't we therefore commit now troops on the ground to actually get rid of the problem? But we don't want to do it, and we highlighted about the problem that Iran is creating. Iran is just putting boots in the ground where the fail is Western to do. Russia is doing the same. By the way, can I just say...
There was a time when the Americans had 150,000 troops on the ground in Iraq, of course, and it didn't succeed.
Absolutely. So to sit here and to claim that the problem is Iran, it's not Iran. The problem is not Syria. The problem is that we created the environment for ISIS to rise. We've got to get rid of them now. We've got to put the boots into the ground. We don't want to do it. Somebody else is doing it for us. That's why Americans and the Russians are working.
But the Iranians and the Russians aren't doing it for us, because 80% of Russian strikes have fallen on the people that drove Assad out of their areas in 2014. 80% drove ISIS out of their areas. It's the anti-ISIS opposition that successfully removed ISIS from its areas. Those are the people that the Russians are bombing. And the Iranians are on the front lines, sometimes against ISIS, sometimes against, not very often, sometimes against Jabhat al-Nusra, but also against Democrats, against the Free Army, against the Syrian population. And this is making the problem much worse. So I completely agree with you that the American occupation and invasion of Iraq was an absolute disaster. And you can go back, not doing anything in 1991, when they'd already destroyed the Iraqi state infrastructure and the Iraqi army, and yet they gave Saddam Hussein permission to use his helicopter gunships to put down the uprising in the south of Iraq in 1991. I think that's a better parallel with what's happening today in Syria than the 2003 parallel. We can blame all of these things. We don't need to say it's either America or Iran. We can recognise that every state is playing a filthy game. We don't need to take sides. Campism is not going to help us get anywhere. We have to say that both Saudi Arabia and Iran are playing a filthy sectarian game, and they're doing it for the same reason, because they don't want the people in their countries asking serious questions about how can we be free and dignified. They want them worrying about Sunni and Shia instead.
Just here.
No affiliation. Just collectively...
Could you give us your name?
Luke Douglas Hume. Just collectively, do the panel agree that Assad is going to go, and if so, when?
Robin, you've spoken very strongly against Assad. What do you think of that?
I'd certainly like to see Assad go. I've been calling for him to go since 2011. The reality of it is this is a really intractable conflict now. Assad has outmaneuvered everyone. Like I said, we've lost who's won? Well, there have been multiple victors, and Bashar al-Assad is one of them. And this actually touches upon your point, sir, as well. You know, Bashar al-Assad, from the start of this uprising, from the start of brutalizing these people, went out and killed the secularists, the Democrats, in order to allow the jihadist fan to grow so that he could say to the world, look, it's a binary choice between me and them. Unfortunately, that's exactly where we are. I mean, I've sat on so many of these panels where we talk about ISIS, we talk about the jihadis, but in the middle we forget the Syrian people. The average Syrian who is suffering, who is dying, who is starving to death. I have so many Syrian friends from whom I hear on a daily basis, their relatives are, you know, starving to death. It's unacceptable. It's disgusting. It's unconscionable what is transpiring. Assad will survive. Sorry, just to answer. Assad will survive in some shape or form, but that's not to say that there won't be sort of a breakdown of the region, which we've essentially already seen.
Are there any circumstances under which Iran would dump Assad?
I think absolutely. I mean, I think Iran is already gaming out and considering, you know, how it will conduct itself in Syria, you know, with or without Assad generally. I mean, they're talking with everyone, you know, to a greater or lesser extent. I think for Iran, what's really important, I mean, I think Iran, you know, would dump Assad in a moment if it comes to that, and they know that that's where the momentum is going. I think for them, it's important to keep some key supply routes open. There's sort of corridors that they need to have in the hands of some political faction that is friendly to Tehran in order to be able to, you know, send, you know, whatever is necessary to Hezbollah in Lebanon. So I think that it's a game of geography and ensuring that, you know, there are corridors. You know, it may end up with a factionalized, you know, broken apart Syria, but, you know, Iran is definitely looking ahead to a potentially post-Assad future.
What about Russia? I mean, Richard, Russia's engagement suddenly in this region, maybe we haven't talked about it enough tonight, is one of the really, I mean, Putin is suddenly in the Middle East, his only ally, and they're not going to let him go, are they?
I think the gaming thing is absolutely important. It is absolutely the most important thing. You know, I think you're absolutely right. I'm sure that Iran and Russia as well have been gaming it, as, you know, in their own very different ways. But I kind of disagree in the sense I think that Iran have gamed it probably time and time again, and they've always ended up with it's Assad or nothing. I think the Iranians think that under the current, you know, under all the circumstances they envisage, if Assad goes, they go, and their credibility and everything else hangs on it. I think the Russian entry. I mean, there's all this talk about Russia and Iran not being on the same page, because I think Russia probably, you know, can game it without Assad, but they've now got themselves into, Russia and Iran are now in a lockbind, partly because of their own joint anti-American rhetoric and other conflicts that they're both involved with America. They've got into a position where they've wound each other up. So neither. I think that Russia probably, in theory, could game it without Assad, but given that they're dependent on Iran to be the boots on the ground, they're also not gaming it without Assad. So they both put all their chips on that square.
Of course, they've got some boots on the ground in Syria, Russia.
Yeah, but I mean, in terms of the people, you know, the people who are the ground troops, the ground troops in Syria now all answer to Iran in one way or another. I mean, the Syrian army loyal to Assad is loyal to Assad, but not Iran, is still there. But the real fighting forces, all you know, the popular committees and the militias are all loyal to Iran.
Mike, sorry.
Mike Martin, no affiliation. What's the Middle East going to look like?
Well, I should say he wrote a very good book about Helmand and knows about and is very opposed to intervention in these countries and knows about intervention in Afghanistan, and therefore it comes with some experience.
Available from Amazon and all good bookshops.
I should say the MOD tried to ban it, which immediately spiked sales. But anyway, Mike.
It's actually going to charity, so David, I'm not giving you a cut from that despicable plug. So my question is a simple one to whoever wants to answer it. What's the Middle East going to look like in 50 years?
Very good question. Very good question. I think we'll go right along the panel from right to left, actually, with that.
Oh my
50 years
time.
What will the Middle East look like?
depends on whose vision you're going to be contemplating. I mean,
what do you think is going to happen?
What do I think? My vision. I mean, I see potential for, the entire Gulf as we know it, the Persian Gulf with the boundaries that we understand them today, like Bahrain, potentially the UAE. I could see those dissolving, and one vast kind of kingdom emerging under some kind of joint, Sunni Arab leadership. I think Iran will, retain its territorial integrity and its position, and it's somewhat disheartening to think about, what two kind of powers like that would mean, a region that's divided in that way. The Levant, I think, remains tricky. I think perhaps the only country that I can imagine staying exactly as it is perhaps Jordan, who's managed somehow, rather miraculously to stand back from the fray on all sides, despite having, this majority Palestinian population.
Well, of course, we'll have got well beyond peak oil, and Saudi Arabia will have lost so much of its international influence. But is there any hope, Shiraz, that we might have moved towards some sort of more moderate, not a word, but one that we can agree to use it for now, some sort of more moderate Islam, that there might be more sense within the region of moving towards a new Islamic enlightenment or some such?
God, will Islam sort itself out in 50 years? You wonder if the Middle East would have sorted itself out. I don't think either of these things will be sorted in 50 years, to be honest. I think the Gulf will still be standing as it pretty much is. They're much more inert as societies, and they have money, which allows them to essentially keep up the rentier bargain with their people. So I think those countries will kind of remain as they are. As for Islam, Islam, if you look at it in that region as well, just over the last 15 years, has been on quite a trajectory. The Saudis can get involved with this debate in a way that other governments can't, just by virtue of being custodians of the holy sites and sort of controlling the sites where Islam essentially.
But the trajectory at the moment doesn't feel in a very helpful direction.
No, we're talking about glacial progress, I think. It's progress, but it's not moving at a particularly fast rate, which is why I said essentially I think we're going to be where we are, more or less in the same place, particularly in that part. I think in the Levant, you will see a greater move towards a sort of more federalized system of governance. I think that's the only way you can really keep it going. It's sort of fashionable to talk about the balkanization of the Middle East and breakup of the Levant, but that sort of idea has been on the table for so long. I don't think it's going to happen. I think there'll be some kind of federalized, as Robin's been saying, these sort of local councils going on down in the south. Well, this is already moving towards a sort of sense of decentralization, towards greater autonomy, and the only way you could keep a country like Syria together now, I think, is like that. Perhaps what's going to be much more interesting to watch, and I don't have a view on it, is North Africa and what happens there, particularly Egypt and Libya.
I mean, it's so far beyond the 50 years as the thought of most kind of speculation and crystal ball gazing. But Robin, what do you think?
Well, when I get home,
it's quite interesting.
When I get home tomorrow, I have to start writing a thing for The Guardian about what do I think of the Arab Spring 5 years on, and this is a reply piece to something that they asked me to write 5 years ago. They asked me to write about Syria. Is there going to be a revolution in Syria? No, I said. There isn't going to be a revolution in Syria, and I gave very good reasons for it too. There you go. I'm not going to even begin to. I think that we are.
Will it be a better place to live in?
I've got no idea. And it ties into many other issues, like, for example, global warming, things like that. It ties into so many issues, it's too far for me to see. What I can say is that I don't think it's glacial. You can't tell what direction we're going in. We're going in lots of different directions at once, but I think there is incredibly rapid change. I think we're at an amazing and terrible moment in history where the societies of the the whole world is changing very fast. The societies of the Middle East are going through revolutionary changes, and I think, was it misattributed to Chairman Mao? Did he say that someone asked him, what do you think of the French Revolution? He said it's too early to tell. Well, there you go. It's just too early to tell. And about religion, I've noticed when I've been interviewing Syrian activists and so on, it's really surprising that you meet a lot of declared atheists and agnostics and people of no religion, quite a lot, which wasn't the case 5-10 years ago. I mean, there may have been people who thought like that, but I didn't really speak about it. So that is happening because of the revolutionary cultural processes, because people are questioning everything. It's happening because people have seen the exploitation of religion by power, by ISIS and Saudi Arabia and Iran and Assad and everyone else, and are disgusted by it. But at the same time, I just read Brian Whittaker's book, Arabs Without God, and it's quite convincing when he shows United Nations human development figures, those countries where life is stable and reasonably prosperous and safe and happy tend to have high atheism counts, and those countries where life is dangerous and unstable tend to have, religion tends to be very important to people. That's not surprising, and I think that the Middle East, certainly in the coming decade, is going through a period of intensifying chaos and terror, and in the short term I would imagine that would increase the religious feeling of people.
Richard, it's very much the sort of question, actually, I can imagine the editor of a newspaper like The Telegraph asking it this time of year, because you're desperate to fill those pages between Christmas and New Year when nothing very much is happening, so the editorial comment comes, so what's going to happen in 50 years in the Middle East then? And what would you say to that editor?
Sod off.
Happy Christmas.
But actually, no. I mean, it's a fun game. I mean, the obvious answer, of course, is we don't know what Britain's going to look like in 50 years. I mean, it's an important question, right? I mean, we don't know what Britain's going to look like in 50 years' time. I mean, I don't think many people think it'll look, constitutionally like it looks today. So to talk about the Middle East, I think in terms of that 20-30 year thing, I mean, I'm totally with Shiraz. I think it'll be, I don't think it'll be functional in a sort of, in a modern state, nation state sort of way. I think federalization is the thing rather than balkanization. I think you're exactly right in a lot of these places. I think you'll see, regional, as America withdraws, particularly if America continues to withdraw, which I think it will do in terms of not wanting to be the world's policeman and no one taking its place. You'll see these regional powers, so you'll have Saudi and its client states. And
you've come from China before. I mean, China, of course.
I think China is the model. I mean, China almost openly wants to recreate that model of international relations, where you have regional powers and their client states. It's almost openly saying that, and I think that's the direction it's heading. The two questions are one, over 50 years, is that sustainable? Is the Chinese model actually sustainable for China, let alone for Saudi Arabia and Iran and Russia very much? Russia, I was just been reading a book about Russia and China, and it just brings it home to you that China says that this is its model, but other countries simply don't do it as well as China's ever done it, and China hasn't always done it very well, as we know, in the last 100 years. So the state security apparatus, the whole idea of this, tribute, regional, throwing your weight around, all backed up by internal state security apparatuses. I think in a way, what we've seen in the last 5 years, that model doesn't work. The technology is getting out of hand, and going back to the gentleman over there who talked about Assad not being to blame for Islamic State. I mean, that's simply not true. I mean they are. I mean, to say that they're the other two sides of the same coin. I mean, it's they both of their methodologies basically come from the state security complex methodology introduced from the Soviet Union in 1920, spread via Islamism, via all the Islamist organizations that followed Leninist models into Al Qaeda, into ISIS, and as we know, ISIS is a mixture of Baathists encouraged by in Iraq, encouraged by Assad's Mukhabarat, who cooperated openly with ISIS in 2008, 2009, 2010. I mean, it's but the question is, can that model sustain itself? And of course, I hope it doesn't. I hope that model collapses. Can't promise it will. But what then takes its place in 50 years' time? Who knows?
Sure.
I'd like to make one more thing. And I really like Robin's point about the changing social attitudes. And I have a sort of joke answer, which I actually do give to my editors. I say, Riyadh will be the capital of the gay world. It's almost open. You go to Riyadh, and people are almost being openly gay in Riyadh. Raqqa, even under ISIS rule, there were feminists. There were feminists and environmentalists. There was I was in Raqqa after Jabal al-Nusra took it over. There was an environmental group doing guerrilla gardening around Raqqa. Under ISIS, sorry, it wasn't ISIS then. This was still under Jabal. It was just as the split was happening. There were these environmental groups going around planting vegetables in motorway reservation, central reservations. These ideas are changing incredibly quickly. The whole idea thing, and that's of course what's going on in the Middle East. What's the Arab Spring is about, is stopping these ideas, and hopefully there is these positive trends which may suddenly take us all by surprise.
Aren't human beings extraordinary? Plant cabbages in the middle of an Islamist revolution. Shiraz, one very quick 50-year thought.
It was just that if you'd asked that question at the start of the 20th century in Europe, look what we did over the course of the first 50 years to ourselves here. So I think what we're seeing right now in the Middle East is a process, and there's going to be a tremendous degree of suffering. There's going to be a lot of loss of life. It's going to be as pointless as the conflicts were in Europe. The First World War is sort of very reminiscent on the streets of Syria today. It's attritional, it's pointless, but it's a process through which the Arabs will have to go through.
We're going to close quite soon. I'm going to take some more questions in a moment, starting with you, sir, right at the front. But before I do, I just want to ask the panel about British policy. Move this right back to home. So what, Britain is now involved in bombing a second country in the region. And I will actually start again with, the Daily Telegraph editorial meeting at the beginning of 2016. What would you advise the British? Where would you advise the British government to put its policy now? And also thinking of de-radicalisation issues at home, which the Conservative government has controversially, as we know, now focusing on non-violent extremism and trying to engage in men and women's minds, as well as criminal actions or potential criminal actions, which is a highly controversial area. So there's the de-radicalisation issue at home, there are refugees, and there's the fact that Britain is now engaged once again in bombing a Middle Eastern country. I mean, if the editor comes to you and says, look, we need to have an editorial policy on this, on the Cameron government and its Syria-Iraq policy, what should it be? What should it be?
I mean, as a matter of principle, because I report, and I actually don't write leaders, and although I express my opinion probably far more than I ought to, I always try and draw the line at actually saying this is what we should be doing. So I'm not going to say bombing is right or wrong. I'm not going to say we should have boots on the ground or not. But what I would say is that what the last 5 years have shown is that things are actually obvious when you think about them. If the Western allies, particularly Britain, France, America, it's actually a 15-year thing. If Britain, France, America, the Western allies, the people we think of as the West, the free world, whether we like individual aspects of whether we like Donald Trump or Corbyn or whatever, if they don't stick together and form common policies, then Western policy will fall apart, which is not surprising, but it's what's happened. And it's what happened in the Arab Spring, and it's what happened before that after 2003. We've had no coherent long-term strategy of what we want in the Middle East.
You could argue because of 2003, actually.
Partly because, so much I mean, I totally agree. But we've had, and as a result, we've had incoherence. And actually, although, protests around the Middle East for years and years have said, West out, West out, West out, there's a consequence to that, and we have to accept that. And the other thing I would say is that partial answers are no answers, and going back to Robin's very first answer, bombing ISIS without having a strategy for the Middle East is a disaster. I said 2 years ago, I actually wrote, when the whole issue of bombing Syria before came up in response to the chemical weapons attack, I said, fine, if you don't want to bomb Assad now, that's fine. It's a perfectly defensible position. But don't come to us in 2 years. I actually said 10 years' time. It happened much quicker. Don't come to us in 10 years' time and say we have to invade. You either say, right, the Middle East is none of our business, and you accept all the consequences, including 9/11s, including all that sort of stuff, or you try and have a strategy that's coherent. That involves, if you're going to use military force, say, right, this is how we're going to use it, these are the terms we're going to use it, and this is the overall policy in which we're going to use it. You don't just sort of say, something nasty happened, they beheaded a couple of journalists, we have to go and bomb that town. You know, that doesn't make any sense.
Robin, I mean, obviously, your first answer would be that all policymakers should read Burning Country, but
that'll solve everything by itself.
As well as,
in fact, if you just buy 10 copies each tonight, you know,
as well as
thousands of people will see that.
What should British policy be now in 2016?
Well, we should have a policy. Which we don't have at the moment. I agree completely with what you were saying. I don't know if it was just to mess up the Labour Party, but it's gestural politics. It's what happened in Paris was awful, so we have to have a debate in Parliament, and then Britain has to be seen to be doing something. But what it's actually, I mean, I'm not against bombing ISIS, because I think that, as I said earlier, I think that tactically on the ground, if it's done in coordination with local groups, you can actually defeat them to some extent. You can keep them hemmed in. You can have an effect on them, but you
have the danger of creating martyrs and encouraging
the narrative. You're offering them the perfect narrative. That, you know, look, here's what they're saying to the Syrian people now. Is like everybody and everything is bombing you. Everybody. The Russian Orthodox Christians have joined together with the Western Christians who are with the Jews, and there are Shia Muslims on Assad's front lines. You are being attacked by all the religions of the world. You were stupid enough in 2011 to rise up in the name of these words that they've taught you from the West, like freedom and democracy, which mean nothing. But now you've learnt that whatever language you came out with, however peaceful you were, you're being attacked by everybody from the West and the East because you're Sunni Muslims. Now, of course, I don't agree with that, but that sounds rather convincing when you're in Syria being bombed. The British, actually, I don't think they are killing many civilians, if any, because their strikes so far really have been precision strikes. They've been on oil fields south of Deir ez-Zor, and where no people are anyway. The Americans have hit ISIS. They've also hit other groups which aren't ISIS, not just Nusra. People on the ground, a lot of Syrians now are experts in that's a Russian plane, that's an American one, that's a French one, but a lot of them aren't. And as far as they're concerned, the whole world is bombing the hell out of them. The only person that isn't being bombed in Syria is the man responsible for 95% of the casualties. He's still free to share the skies with the Russians and the Americans.
Shiraz, on British policy, the de-radicalisation agenda at home, do you think it's going to work?
I just want to say one quick thing about the bombing, because I want to break rank. I think we were right to bomb Islamic State. I support that for the simple reason that, actually, I think you just touched on it, Robin. We are being very precise about who we're taking out there, and this idea that if we're going into to bomb Islamic State, that there has to be, you know, a solution to the Syrian conflict. There is no solution. We are not going to fix Syria, so we need to pull all of this out and say what is the objective in fighting ISIS. ISIS is a counter-terrorism problem as far as we're concerned. Syria is a much bigger problem, one that we're not going to fix. But they're a counter-terrorism problem. So I think the Prime Minister was right to drone individuals there who are plotting attacks in our country, who are trying to kill our citizens and attack our public events. It's right that if we have intelligence that we go in and do that, rather than to outsource our national security to the United States. We're becoming like the Saudis. We're going to live under an American security umbrella. That's not right, I don't believe. So it's right to hit Islamic State, and it's also morally right to hit them. This is a movement that, if it had the capability, would outperform the worst successes of the Assad regime. It just so happened that they don't have that capability. But if any of you watched today that report on Sky News, I mean, that is staggering. The idea that Islamic State won't perpetrate an atrocity in Europe that is comparable to 9/11 is a misnomer. It will happen. It's an inevitability. So this is happening. So we need to be proactive in working against ISIS now in order to prevent this. Now, turning to domestic policy and the PREVENT program. PREVENT has now operated for more than a decade. It's had hundreds of millions of pounds invested in this. And there's been a whole industry around it that has used a lot of really interesting words about building capacity in Muslim communities, about resilience. And frankly, these are as hollow as the words freedom and democracy might be to a member of ISIS. As soon as the big test of PREVENT came, which was the Syrian crisis, PREVENT failed. Hundreds of British Muslims got up and went to participate in that conflict. And not just men, an sort of paralleled number of women got up and went. And then we had this third phase most recently, which is so staggering, that entire families got up and went. 3 generations of an entire family from Bedfordshire just get up and go.
So what should we do about it?
I think the government needs to accept that Prevent has failed. It needs to essentially find a new way. Now, it's something I've given a lot of thought to. I don't have all the solutions. So I'm not going to say yet what I think, but I am working on it. If we could all reconvene in a few weeks, then I'll sort of share my thoughts.
Azadeh, what should British policy be in the region?
Well, British policy in the region, I mean, we've talked about this at length. I mean, I disagree with Shiraz. I think that if bombing IS on the ground was going to alter, the military operational dynamic, that would be one thing. But when it is not doing that in a significant way, I think that what we lose, in terms of the narrative and the perceptions of what we're doing, continually bombing a region. The same people who, the women I spoke to, who went out and protested against Assad, they were, the first people out on the streets in Raqqa protesting, saying we want the fall of the regime. They said the West abandoned us. They didn't even pay attention to us. That was their perception of how their uprising was received in the West. So the attention only comes 4 years in with bombs. And to me, whatever kind of 3 or 4 precision drone strikes against, someone who might be targeting, I think that's compelling what you're saying. But overall, when you're sort of looking at the trajectory of what we've done, Britain, the United States, and the region in the last 10 to 15 years, I think it does, far more damage than anything else. You mean
you wouldn't have started from here? You want a more coherent strategy from the beginning?
Yes, absolutely. And then very quickly on Prevent, and I'll just respond to this with my university lecturer hat on. I mean, I think that Prevent is so enormously damaging, and I think feeds into the narrative that lures so many young people to go and think that they're doing something for Muslims by fighting with IS. I mean, at my university, the atmosphere and the way that Prevent is becoming enacted, and my fellow lecturers, if a girl, this happened to one of our students, decided over the summer that she wanted to start covering her hair, and collectively people started whispering, do we need to look at radicalisation? Should we look into her family? Do we have to convene, a meeting of the department to look at whether she's been radicalised?
Because you now might have a legal responsibility to do that.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's part of the list of things that we're supposed to observe amongst our students, and it's essentially puts us in the position of interpreting any kind of move towards religiosity, interpreting that as a move towards criminalization, and then being in a position of having to inform on our students.
I think it's worth saying, though, that there are stakeholders within the community who are trying to misrepresent as well what Prevent stands for. The problem is they are winning that misrepresentation. So regardless of what you think about Prevent, it has an image problem. And because it has an image problem, the very constituency that you want it to reach, it has failed by virtue of that alone. Regardless of its internal merits and coherence or whatever, it has failed. And the statutory footing is a disaster. I say to all my students, I'm going to refer the lot of them, therefore I'm in the clear. And then it's up to the government what to do.
We're going to close in a few minutes. I want to take 2 more questions. You've been waiting very patiently. One here, and you've asked a question, and here. Yeah, I'm going to take 2 more, and then we'll ask the panel to answer them. Sir.
Frank Jackson, former co-chair of the World Disarmament Campaign.
And wearing a white poppy.
And wearing a white poppy, yes. I think about the old joke about the man says, how do I get to Little Muddlecombe from here? Yokel, if I was going to Little Muddlecombe, I wouldn't start from here. And likewise, how you're going to achieve peace and stability in the Middle East, I wouldn't be starting from here. Now, of course, that's not very helpful in the immediate situation. But nevertheless, if you go back and look at the history of how you got the many missteps that have been made, then that should help to illuminate what you can do at the present time. And I haven't got time to go into a lot of detail, but I certainly believe that there is no military solution to any of these problems. In fact, talking about 50 years, the human race is beset with a whole range of literally existential problems over that period of time, and the question of what we do for the Middle East is only a tiny part of it. And the all these problems have no military solutions. What they do need is cooperation at every level, from the individual to the global. So I would certainly start by stopping the bombing by everybody. I disagree with the panel members who think that it can achieve something in the short term, maybe, but I don't even want to kill Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. I'd like to see him and brought to justice. I don't want to kill him, or still less all the thousands of misguided young people.
So what would your question to the panel be?
Well, no, I'm making a comment rather than a specific question.
No, it's a passionate
Yes,
appeal for peace.
Yeah. Well, I think basically I've made my point that we really must. Just one last point. Well, I do agree with Robin is about the local government, and that's where we ought to be putting efforts into, rather than killing people, whoever they are.
Well, and we are. British taxes are going to fund programmes, I know, that assist in local government in Syria. So, yeah, last question, and then we'll round up from the panel. Well, there's one just next to you. Go on, then. Because we haven't heard one woman from the floor yet, so you go on.
That's a quick question. One country that's not been mentioned yet is Turkey. Yeah, sorted. So,
thwarted.
So maybe some comments on that.
Let her ask the question.
It's just I wanted to ask your opinions on the significance of Turkey. We've talked about Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia. And this is all bearing in mind all the accusations that have been levelled at Turkey with regards to both its indirect support of Daesh and the Kurds, how they're treating the Kurds who are fighting.
And of course, a haven of hundreds of thousands of refugees as well. You know, with
absolutely.
An unwilling host in many ways. If we could just round, I mean, I'm hesitate to try and round up the whole debate, but round up perhaps with a thought about Turkey and a sense of you know, not Mike's 50 years, but a sense of how this year is going to look in the region right along the panel. Perhaps I'll start with you, Azadi. I mean, you know, you've seen a lot of this from very close up. We haven't talked about Turkey. Very, you know, fair point. How should we look at trying to bring Turkey back in so that they're not potentially supporting IS or on the wrong side on refugees, as it were? And that may be the wrong way of putting it.
I mean, I think that the Turkish position and the question of Turkey, and I can't believe we went the whole evening without talking about Turkey. That's absolutely true. Is you know, it's an extraordinarily intricate conflict to begin with. The Turkish position is even more so in that, you know, it has its Kurdish problem, which it has reignited after a couple of years. It has this long, porous border that it's seeking to manage, you know, sometimes more effectively than others. It is, you know, very, very vested in you know, opposing what Iran is doing in the region as well. I think for Turkey, and the time that I spent down there in southern Turkey, what really struck me was that despite, you know, this being such a fraught border, life seemed to go on very naturally. I mean, commerce was enacted, people went back and forth. It didn't seem necessarily like a militarized zone. I mean, Turks were doing business, people from the other side were going in. So in a way, kind of life continues, and you know, it's not the kind of sealed off, you know, militarized kind of zone that we think of from afar. So I think Turkey is trying to, you know, keep some sort of, you know, normality in the south of the south of its country, but at the same time, you know, with the Kurdish issue, it becomes enormously complicated how they're going to handle that. You know, I think that the refugee problem as well is the way that we've got to go in with Turkey. I mean, they house, I don't know what the estimates are now,
2
but
million.
2 million, an enormous number of refugees. And in order for Turkey, I mean, Turkey, unlike Lebanon, for example, a country that genuinely risks being destabilized by the number of refugees that it's taking, Turkey can take that on, but it needs assistance, and that's certainly something that has got to be part of the political discussion with Turkey. You know, how to bring Turkey around, how to encourage Turkey to police that border more effectively. I mean, I think there's a certain degree of chaos as well. When I was down there, you know, I was on a flight going down to the south, and we weren't taking off for an hour, and everyone was wondering what's going on, and it turned out that because Turkey was deploying, this was right after that big flare-up in the summer. Turkey was trying to deploy so many of its military down to the south that they had loaded hard weapons into the cargo of a civilian flight. So we had to sit there on the tarmac. They took the weapons off the flight, and we went on, and about four rows of very disgruntled-looking Turkish military officers got off the plane. So, I mean, I think that the Turks are trying to handle an enormously complicated situation and are stuck right in the middle of it.
Shiraz, I wonder if you could just focus on the pacifist point. I mean, you were the strongest proponent on the platform for Britain being involved in engaging in bombing another Middle Eastern country. I mean, is it really a good idea?
Well, the language is important here. Bombing another Middle Eastern country. We're not bombing another Middle Eastern country. We are bombing Islamic State. It was different in Iraq in 2003. We were engaged in the process of regime change.
We're bombing oil fields.
We're bombing Islamic State. Well, we're trying to hurt Islamic State by virtue of doing that. We're not trying to enact
David Cameron said one of the reasons why Britain would get involved is we've got these very tiny little precision weapons. It made them sound very friendly. And then the first night, there's £500 paid-away bombs being dropped on oil fields.
No, and even sorry to jump in, but even the anti-IS group, Raqqa is being silently slaughtered. I mean, their Twitter feed just reads, we're being bombed tonight. Raqqa is being bombed. I mean, they perceive it. They've talked about cultural centers, all sorts of places that are not necessarily military targets.
I mean, that was going on before we got involved. Let's be clear. Look, and I don't think we should be engaging in symbolic bombing as sort of response to Paris, but in the well-known cases where we've done it, even before the vote in Parliament when David Cameron authorised the RAF to go in and drone these individuals, that's on the basis of specific information. I would challenge anyone to tell me that was a wrong thing to do. So we have to be. Well,
there's this idea that they should be brought to justice. We've got the SAS there. They can.
Well, so I respect very much your principle and your point, but if I may say respectfully, I just don't regard it as being practical to bring someone like Baghdadi to justice. I don't see the reality of how we'll be capable of doing that. The same thing with the individuals who we droned from our own country who were in the middle of Raqqa. How do we anticipate arresting them?
You're saying the caliphate will win.
Who's saying that, sorry?
That's what you're saying. If we can't bring al-Baghdadi to justice, it means the caliphate will only be strengthened by what we're doing.
I also reject that narrative. I mean, the idea that, yes, Islamic State does message to its people saying you are being bombed by everybody, but not everyone buys into that. The Raqqa is being silently slaughtered group itself. I've spent a lot of time with them. They're not all united in this view that it's a bad thing to hit them. Far more damaging, and I accept this point, is that if we are going in, I wouldn't stop just at bombing ISIS. I would be bombing Assad's troops, because actually on the ground, when you look at the average Sunni on the ground, what are they saying? The average Sunni civilian, he's saying the West will only get involved for its own interests, but we are sacrifices. So it's not just, oh, your bombs are falling on those people. It's saying, look, we are being surrendered to this killing machine.
I feel that argument is one that's going to continue in the bar. Just closing with you two, Robin and Richard. I mean, is Turkey a reliable ally, given that they have their own Kurdish situation and which they appear to be using the opportunity to go far more strongly on the Kurds than they might otherwise do?
Is it a reliable ally? That's too complicated a question. I have to imagine myself as a British politician, which I can't do. But what I would say is that in 2013, I went into the north of Syria twice. And the first time I went they were letting people with Syrian passports through without asking them any questions. But if you didn't have a Syrian passport or your document was out of date, you couldn't go through. So I didn't have a Syrian passport, I couldn't go through. My friends went through, I went round, met some Kurdish boys, gave them a bit of money. I thought they were going to take me for a long walk over the hills, but actually they just took me round the corner and told me to climb over the wall into the same border point that I'd just been. And I was saying, no, and I was there like crouching under this wall, calling my friends, saying, they're telling me to jump over the wall, and they're saying, just do it, that's fine. And I did it, and the boys told me, oh, we've taken lots of Chechens across this way. So certainly at that point, I think the border is being much more carefully policed now, probably still not carefully enough. So there's that. And I think that one reason for that is that the Turks see, as the Turkish state sees the PYD building the Kurdish political party which is dominant in Rojava, in the Kurdish areas of Syria. They don't want it building something which could later become a state. And they certainly, and neither do the Arabs area, they certainly they certainly don't want it linking up, taking Arab territory to link up the cantons, which it's trying to do at the moment. That's an issue. They see it from their own point of view. There's a long struggle between Turkish and Kurdish nationalism. It's a long story, and it's not a happy one. And Kurds have been suffering from it for a long time. There's that. At the same time, I must say that Turkey has been more generous than any other neighbour in welcoming refugees, in allowing them to work, although it doesn't, but it does allow them. In border towns, I've seen them setting up, they've allowed Syrians to set up their own charities, workshops, orphanages, etc., etc. So a lot of Syrians feel very grateful to Turkey for that. But it's like any state, it's a mixture of good and bad and different interests.
Richard.
Turkey, I think, I'm going to add in Qatar. I mean, no one's mentioned Qatar at all. Qatar's probably the single most important player in the whole thing. The whole thing, right from the start of the Arab Spring in 2011. And I mean, it's too late to start getting into this, but Turkey and Qatar, I think there's absolutely no doubt now, used the Arab Spring very consciously together. Hijack is probably not too strong a word. In favour of the Muslim Brotherhood and a particular strand of Islamist politics, which it thought was a solution. It's been a complete disaster. It's a complete disgrace, actually. I have no sympathy with either government. It's been actually disgraceful. Having said that, I do agree with Robin about internally in Turkey, the sanctuary they've given to the refugees is amazing. And I'm not I mean, just that very strategic miscalculation they made was they did it in a very dishonest way. And it's caused disaster, and not nearly enough focus has been on that, right from the fall of Gaddafi and the arrival of Belhaj, if anyone knows who he is, in Libya, the day that Gaddafi was driven out of Tripoli. And everything's gone wrong since then, actually. Too late to start on. I'd like to come back to Frank, I mean, on a totally different note. Local councils, I was going to say this when Robin was speaking about them earlier. Just set this in context. Local councils, great. Britain has been supporting local councils in Syria. As Robin said, long term, this has to be the solution. But local councils without military involvement, what happened? I was in both Aleppo and Raqqa in May 2013, and I spoke to both the leaders of the local councils that have been set up in Aleppo and in rebel-held Aleppo and rebel-held Raqqa. And in Raqqa, this was they'd only just taken Raqqa, a couple of weeks before. So it was a very new thing. But aid was already getting into Raqqa. Germany was supplying, Germany was supplying hospitals in Raqqa already through the local council. And Aleppo was a much bigger organisation. They actually had, I went to the council offices. I met the council leader. I met the guy who was in charge of rubbish collection. The German aid guy who was running German aid supplies. He had a bit of a joke going because he was constantly sending German rubbish trucks into Aleppo to deal with the rubbish problem. And he kept saying, please tell me if you see any rubbish trucks. What happened in both those places? 3 weeks after I met him, the local council leader in Raqqa was disappeared by ISIS, taken off the street one day, not seen again. What happened in Aleppo? Those council officers were bombed by Assad. They were bombed by Assad again and again and again. That was the target for him. I'm not having local democracy. He drove that local council out. ISIS then came and helped him because they then, they were still in Aleppo at the time. All that money was wasted. Well, it's probably not wasted, but very nice of Britain and Germany to send in aid trucks, send in supplies, send in rubbish trucks, fire engines, all the rest of it. It was all bombed to shreds. I mean, nice idea. But
an anti-aircraft system in that context is much more useful than several £million of charity, because if the people could shoot those planes out of the sky, then they could do it themselves. Syrians are hard-working people who could quickly get the economy going and get their schools and hospitals going again, but they're being bombed horribly every day.
We have to close with that thought. Robin Yassin Kassab, Richard Spencer, Shiraz Maher and Azadeh Moaveni, and this has been First Wednesday at Frontline, and thank you very much for coming.